Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuel Podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist now retired from full-time work, but still writing for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. I got interested in ethanol's early days after hearing some of the old-timers' stories. I got to thinking these ought to be recorded. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their stories. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to my old bosses, Joe and Tom Bryan at BBI International, for agreeing to produce this podcast as an Ethanol Producer Magazine offering. For my first interview, I'm visiting with their dad, Mike Bryan, one of those old timers with stories to tell. Mike, welcome. Tell me, how did you get your start in ethanol?
Well, thank you, Sue. It's I guess good to be referred to as an old timer. I suppose that's not necessarily a bad thing. I actually went to work for a small ethanol plant in Grafton, North Dakota, called Alchem Limited. It was a 10 million gallon a year ethanol plant, and worked there for about 7 years. They started out doing their ethanol marketing and distillers grain marketing, and then worked into more of a management role there as time went on. And so that was kind of my introduction to the ethanol industry. And then I was offered an opportunity from the National Corn Growers Association in St. Louis to head up their ethanol and corn sweetener program on a national level, working with the state corn growers associations across the country and doing some lobbying and so on in Washington, D.C. And so that's kind of how the first I was in the industry almost 30 years, and the first 14 years of it I was at Alchem Limited in Grafton, and then 7 years with the National Corn Growers before Kathy Bryan and I started BBI International in June of 1995.
Cool. See, at the time, Alchem was actually a big ethanol plant, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it was. There were a lot of smaller farm plants. The small, still on every hill kind of concept that originally was laid out really never materialized because we realized very early on that you had to have a plant of some kind of substance in production capability in order to be competitive. And so, there was a time when they thought, every other farmer up and down the road would have a small ethanol plant on their farm. And but that really never materialized, just simply because of economics, production economics.
Yeah. So, at what kinds of things were you doing at National Corn Growers then?
Well, worked with the state corn growers and just helping them in whatever way we could from a national level to spread the word on ethanol, help develop ethanol. The industry, Sue, is a very organic industry. It's an industry that grew from the farmer level up and not from the top down. And which is one of the things that makes it a very strong industry, politically strong. Congress, both federally and state, can turn their backs on large corporations, but it's very difficult for Congress to turn its back on thousands of farmers who have put their life savings into developing ethanol plants in their communities and say, no, we're going to just we're going to turn our back on you. And that's one of the strengths of the industry, is that it is organic and has grown from the ground up.
Cool. You talked about when we were talking earlier about some of the fun promotions you did, like the yellow, was it yellow cards or
Well,
yellow nickels?
there was a number of different things that we did. The promotion of ethanol was more challenging than the promotion of gasoline because we didn't have deep pockets, so we had to do things that would allow us to get the word out on ethanol, but not spend millions of dollars on national advertising. And one of those things we did was kind of a simple thing. It was called the Yellow Nickel promotion, and we work with state corn growers associations in various states around the country, and we would paint nickels yellow, which is probably a federal offense now that we look back at it. But anyway, and then we would go to gasoline stations with the local corn growers. And the corn growers would come out in force, and they would pump the gasoline for people as they pulled into the station that was promoting it, and wash their windshields and then hand them a brochure, talk about ethanol, and for every gallon of gasoline that was sold, they would give them a yellow nickel. And it did three things. One, it gave us an opportunity to talk to people about ethanol. It gave us an opportunity to hand them a brochure and so on. And finally, it gave us an opportunity to show how the sale of ethanol, the purchase of ethanol, circulated through the community, because these yellow nickels would show up a year later at a grocery store and so on. And somebody who actually filled up their tank would say, "Oh, I remember that." And there was a small thing, and some may say a silly thing, but it was very effective in communicating with people on a personal level. Sometimes we had cards that we would hand out to gasoline stations that said, "Thanks for selling ethanol blends." Or conversely, if there was a station who had a sign outside that said "No ethanol in our gas," we had little cards that we handed out to them saying, "Shame on you for not supporting America's farmers." So it was just small things like that we did that um, kind of helped, again, on a grassroots level, promote the use of ethanol.
Cool. BBI is well known for the fuel ethanol workshop, and you weren't at the first ones, but I understand that Kathy may have been at like that first fuel ethanol workshop, or if not the first, the second one, and in 1985. Can you talk about some of those early days that or maybe some of her stories, if you weren't at some of those?
Well, the first fuel ethanol workshops were run by, I think the company was Gespercatus, and so it was a single company promoting ethanol, yes, and trying to get people together, but basically promoting their enzymes for the ethanol industry. And so they were small. There were 40, 50, 60 people, and um, and they did grow some during that time, but they always remained rather small. When the industry, when the fuel ethanol workshop really started to take off, was actually about 1995, 96, when Kathy and I took that over, the fuel ethanol workshop over from Gespercatus, and made it an industry wide. In other words, there was no specific supplier that was doing the workshop. It was for everyone. And that's when it really started to grow, and it grew pretty quickly. In fact, I think the largest fuel ethanol workshop we had, I forget the year, but it was over 5,000 people, and almost 400 plus exhibitors. But it's just the fuel ethanol workshop. It has just become a mainstay for the industry in terms of exchanging technological ideas, new ideas, and so on. It's become a very integral part of this industry.
One of the things I remember from those first FEWs I went to, which was in the mid 2000, late 2000, 2007, I think is that big one. And I didn't go to that one in Denver. But it was Larry Johnson and you getting together, Larry with his handlebar mustache. I understand Larry's kind of one of those old timers, now gone, sadly, but who was really creative in his ethanol promotions. Can you tell a few stories about Larry?
Well, Larry was a very unique individual for those who know him. He was the F, and he drove around, and he was from Minnesota, drove around in a van in more states than just Minnesota, I might add. He was all the way down into North Carolina on several occasions. But just knew the industry well, was a great spokesman for it, a very likable guy, and yeah, he was just one of these people who really understood what needed to be done in the industry, and with his robust handlebar mustache and gregarious personality, was able to talk to farmers, talk to customers about ethanol, and he did a lot of lobbying, especially in the state of Minnesota. And he and a fellow by the name of Ralph Groshen and Kathy actually were very instrumental in getting legislation passed in Minnesota for the use of ethanol in all grades of gasoline, with the exception of premium. And I believe that Minnesota was the first state to do that, and still to this day, that requirement is in place. So Larry was very instrumental in those kinds of things. Great spokesman for the industry.
I think you also talk a bit about another spokesman that was dealing with mechanics. I don't remember his name, but you talked about him making a lot of headway with mechanics who are misinformed about ethanol in engines.
Well, yeah, his name was Bob Reynolds, and Bob is still around, and I think he's retired now. But again, going back to the oil industry spreading misinformation, there was a lot of misinformation out there that ethanol would harm your automobile, and it wouldn't run properly, and so on and so forth. And so Bob Reynolds started to develop in fact, he did, there's several editions of it now, a small publication that explained what ethanol, how it interacted in your vehicle, and so on. And one of the things that happened is people would have a problem with their car, and they would go into the mechanic, and one of the first things the mechanic would ask, well, what kind of gasoline are you burning? Well, I use ethanol. There's your problem. That's the problem right there. So Bob set up a program where he went out and literally met with groups of mechanics and explained ethanol, explained the benefits of it, explained, he knew the engine, he knew the automobile engine inside and out. And so he could talk about it and relate to them. And it changed a lot of minds in the mechanics industry about ethanol. And it was a very crucial point an effort, and that was sponsored by the RFA. Bob was sponsored by the RFA, but I went with him to several meetings with mechanics, and there was just a lot of questions, a lot of skepticism. And by the time we left a couple hours later, I think a lot of those things were put at ease, and so Bob was very instrumental in that particular segment of the industry.
It was also an important thing that ethanol advocates got race car drivers to use ethanol as well, wasn't it?
Oh,
that dates back to that era. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I just want to say the groups that have, because of the opposition from the oil industry, concerns from consumers, concerns from the EPA, concerns from Congress, both state and federal. Groups like the Renewable Fuels Association and Growth Energy, American Coalition for Ethanol, Clean Fuels Development Coalition, all of those groups were absolutely critical to helping build this industry because the oil industry was opposed to us. There was only one way, and they were the distributor of our product. There was only one way that we could overcome that, and that was through congressional, both on a state and national level, congressional action to force the industry to use ethanol. And it was without those groups, even today, without those groups, the industry would have a lot of challenges. There was another. I would just say that in addition to the main, the bigger associations, I just wanted to talk about Shirley Ball from Montana, who organized a group of women to support ethanol and agriculture in general, called the Red Hats. And Shirley Ball and this group of women from Montana would come to Washington, D.C. in their bright red hats, and they would often bring cookies and cakes and so on made from distiller's grain from the ethanol industry and hand them out to senators and congressmen and so on. But I can, to this day, I remember them going up and down the halls of Congress and striking fear into the hearts of congressmen and senators just because, oh my God, the Red Hats are here, And she did a great job of promoting ethanol and promoting agriculture in general. So, on a lesser level, I suppose, than the big trade associations, but nonetheless, again, very organic, very down home, and that's what the industry really is all about.
Yeah. You talked about a book that Bob Reynolds did, but you wrote one too called The Handbook of Starting an Ethanol Plant. When did you write that one up?
Well, we got early on. We started to do a lot of feasibility work. At BBI, started to do a lot of feasibility work for ethanol plants. In fact, I think probably 25 or more % of the industry, we did the feasibility studies for those projects, and so it became necessary as we did more and more of those to kind of have a handbook on what the stages were, what the requirements were, what to actually develop an ethanol plant. And so the plant development handbook became kind of a guide to those endeavors. Sue, I just want to say one of the things that's so fun and so unique about this industry, especially in the early days, a group of farmers would get together at the local cafe for coffee, as they've been probably doing for the last 40 years. And somebody would say, you know what, we ought to develop one of those ethanol plants here, help get rid of our corn. And, the 10, 15 of them around the table, and they'd say, yeah, let's do that. And they'd throw in a few $1,000s each, and they would hire BBI to do a feasibility study. And sometimes it came out well, other times it came out not so well. And so that's kind of the way the industry developed, is just from a coffee shop, farmers sitting around talking about how can we help ourselves in our farms, but also how can we help our community grow. And that's just the wonderfully unique thing about this industry, is just the organic nature of it, and how it's just blossomed into this. And not now, more and more larger corporations have have become involved in it and bought up a number of ethanol plants, but it's still farmer based. And I live in northern Minnesota, and I play golf up there. And there are farmers who play golf with me who sell their corn to ethanol plants, and they think it's great, and it is great. It helps the community and helps the local farmer.
It does. My nephew farms in southern Minnesota, and he joined one of the ethanol co-ops. Well, it's one of the co-ops that was at it, which he joined, and he said it's been worth $1 a bushel of corn that he sells them. What he gets back either in dividends from the plant profitability, or I think it also includes the higher price of corn when the plant needs to get corn in. So yeah,
Right.
it's been a real economic development um, engine for rural America. Um, do you have
Well,
any other stories you'd like to share?
well, I don't know stories, but I do want to give a bit of a shout out to people who work in the plants. We look at the cost of producing a gallon of ethanol has continually come down, and certainly some of that cost reduction has been the development of new technologies and so on by companies who service the industry. Uh, but I want to give a shout out to the plant people too, because so many of these people who work in the plant, maintenance managers, uh, just shift people who work there, through common sense, have said, if we recycle this water, or if we change this stream and run it through here first, I think we could save a little bit of money. And so over the years, it's been a penny here, 2 cents there, 5 cents there, 3 cents there, and over the years, much of the reduction in the cost of production has come from just common sense people who work in these plants and are able to generate cost savings just by slight changes to the production process. And so it's a combination of both uh, changes in technology, major changes in technology, and everyday small incremental changes that go on in the plant. And I think that's a real um, uh, tribute to the people who work in these plants and take their jobs very, very seriously.
Yes, and I hope in these podcasts to talk to some of the people that can talk about what those early plants were like, and all the things they had to learn and all the unknowns. And there's some great stories out there that hope we can capture in this podcast. Understanding the history of ethanol, I think, is important for the current generations, particularly as it's become more corporate. Um, what's your hope for this podcast series on the history of ethanol?
Well, I guess I would really, first of all, we want to see the industry continue to grow, and it's very interesting because the industry, the ethanol industry has really evolved. I know our company is working on aviation fuels, and that's going to be, I believe, a major um, step forward for the ethanol industry, and those kinds of things. I think we're seeing, and I think we're also seeing the development of better uses, higher uses for distillers grain. I think distillers grain in this industry has been one of those things that's been a co-product, as it's called, but in fact, it could be one of the major products that comes out of this industry. It's a tremendously effective livestock feed, and plus the fact now some plants are reusing remanufacturing, if you will, that distiller's grain, extracting more starch out of it and in fact more ethanol out of it, and coming up with a very high protein, high fiber distiller's grain. So I think the industry is just really, over the last few years, has really started to evolve from, yeah, we put some ethanol in gasoline and we're all happy, to an industry that is really looking towards the future in terms of aviation fuel, in terms of much higher quality feedstocks, and so on. And so I think the industry has a very bright future. But to this day, the oil industry still is not our friend necessarily. And so we have to continually deal with that. And we have to deal with legislative issues and the EPA, and how is the EPA under changes in administrations, a new EPA director, are they going to be favorable towards ethanol blends and those kinds of things. So it's a continual battle that's been going on for 35 years, maybe longer, and gotten better, but still can be a fragile industry when it comes to government and the EPA and so on.
Very true. Very true. Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you willingness to be my first guest on the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Appreciate it. And hope you have a good year ahead. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Sue. I appreciate it. You have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.